Hello everyone, I wanted to welcome you to our event on CBAM and competitiveness, miracle or mission impossible. My name is Tomasz Włostowski. I'm the leader of the task force on CBAM here at BSP. BSP is Business Science Poland. We're an association of Polish business and science connecting it to the EU agenda. Our members represent the cross-section of the Polish economy. We employ over 150,000 people from all sectors, including, of course, energy intensive, such as metallurgy, refining, fuels, chemicals, fertilizers, but other sectors as well, including infrastructure, transport, financial services, and others. Today we're here to talk about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We have an excellent panel with us, and we have an excellent keynote speaker that I would like to introduce now. This is MEP, Polish MEP Izabela Kloc. She is the member of the Industry and Energy Committee of the European Parliament, and she will be the author of the CBAM opinion of the ITRE committee. Ms. Kloc started her professional career as a teacher. She entered regional politics and local government in 1998 in her local Silesia. In 2005, she joined the lower house of the Polish Parliament, the Sejm, where she was representing for a number of years. In 2014, she entered the Senate, and in 2015, she joined the Polish Sejm again, and she was the chair of the Committee on EU Affairs, which is the committee that deals with European affairs in the Polish Parliament. In 2019, she was elected to the European Parliament. She's a member of the ITRE committee, as I've mentioned, and that of course makes sense because she's from Silesia, which is the region where a lot of the energy intensive coal mines are located in Poland. So she's quite well familiar with the challenges of decarbonization. Ms. Kloc, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We are in the era of rapid economic and social changes. The main narrative of the Green Deal is a major European driver. Many believe the climate is the #1 global issue. Some are even declaring a war on climate change. This belief and statements form the public debate nowadays, and I only wish we submitted it to serious assessment before throwing ourselves into the unknown. That is why I am pleased to host the conference CBAM Competitiveness, Mission Impossible. Climate transition is economic transition. Slogans said we are looking at the largest economic project of the century. The question we must ask is if we are ready. Is every EU member state and every EU region on equal footing? Let's see huge gaps in economic performance around Europe. In 2090, almost 55% of the EU's GDP was generated by 3 EU member states: Germany, France, and Italy. 10 EU member states contributed less than 1% of the EU total GDP. Poland contributed by 3.8%. In terms of EU regions, differences are even more significant. 11 Polish regions fall into category of less 65% of the EU average GDP per capita, and 5 regions fall into category 65 to 80%. This is reality for most of Central and Eastern European countries. Special position of Poland rests also in its energy mix. In 2020, almost 72% of energy was produced from coal, 9.1% from gas, and 10.8% from renewables. This is a unique situation. No other member state faces the same challenge. Given the very short time frame and amount of investments linked to complete change of national infrastructure. The estimated bill for the energy transition in Poland can cost 240 billion to year 2030. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is no trifle, as some participant of Friday climate protest would imagine. I must say that EC proposal on CBAM solves one issue but opens many more. The hottest one is phasing out of free allowances. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to see representatives of sectors included in CBAM in today's panel. I believe we need to listen to their objections. As I'm reporter for the ITRE opinion on CBAM, I will do my best to reflect their concerns in the final version of the opinion. Thanks to ITRE's shared competence on CBAM report, I will be their voice also in a trilogue negotiation. Welcome and have a good debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Klotz. So with this, I wanted to start our panel debate, but maybe before I start, I have to address a certain elephant in the room. What we have on this panel, as you can see, it's can derogatively be referred to as a manel. We have only men. That's not intentional. We tried to do what we could to get more women on our panel. As a defense, I can just say two things. One, we had our MEP speak, and I think you'll agree she dwarfs us in terms of experience, importance, and charm. So that's number one. And two, we can assure you that our next event on CBAM is going to be all-female. But with this, I wanted to introduce our panelists. First, we have Marc Poulain. Marc is the International Trade Director for AFEP, which is the Association of Private French Companies. You group over 100 largest private enterprises in France. As the International Trade Director, Marc focuses, of course, on international trade issues in AFEP, among them incorporating sustainable development goals into the trade agenda. Before working for AFEP, Marc's been working with the French judiciary. As a part of that, he was a seconded expert to DG Trade, where he focused on a lot of WTO issues, including the government procurement agreement, bilaterals in Asia, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore. He studied at the French National School of Administration, and he graduated from Paris Institute of Political Science. Next, we have Peter Boczek, who is the Director for Industrial Policy and Competitiveness at CEFIC. CEFIC is the Chemical Chemical European Council. CEFIC groups the entire chemical industry in Europe. It's a huge industry. Peter's been with CEFIC for over 20 years in various positions relating to climate, environment. Sorry. Peter's also, before that, Peter's worked for a fertilizer company. He's been working in a fertilizer association, and he has a doctorate in agricultural studies where he focused on plant nutrition. Then we have Killian, who's our expert from Eurometaux. Killian's been leading the Energy and Climate Change Committee at Eurometaux, which is the association of European non-ferrous metals industry. Before that, Killian, see, I had it. Killian's been working for 5 years at leading public affairs consultancy in Brussels, Fleischmann-Hillard, and before that he was with DG Energy studying security of supply issues in Eastern Europe. And then we have Karsten Neuhoff, who's the professor of economics and business law at, sorry, I need to go back to my notes here, just for a second. Business law at the Technical University of Berlin. He's also the head of climate policy department at DAW, which is the German Institute for Economic Research. He focuses on carbon pricing and power market design and policies that focus on ensuring that the successful to that we have a successful transformation to climate neutrality. He does a lot of independent scientific research. He works for the federal government on the Sustainable Finance Advisory Council. He has published extensively. He has over 42 articles, 4 books. And he holds a master's degree in physics from University of Heidelberg and a PhD in economics from University of Cambridge. So this is our excellent panel. Now I wanted to give each of you around 5 minutes to introduce your main concerns and the things you like about CBAM. Tell me which things you like, which things you don't like in each of your industries and associations. Mark, we'll start with you.
Thank you. We'll just provide a short presentation on what is AFEP position on CBAM. So it's a position which has been nurtured by a study we made at the beginning of the year to collect evidences on whether CBAM or other means of tackling carbon leakage were the most appropriate instrument. And also based, of course, on the opinions from our membership, and to try to adjust their needs and feedback on CBAM. Yeah. Sounds better now. So I will start with the evidence-based approach on CBAM. So we made a comprehensive study on what is the interaction between international trade and climate change, to see what is the contribution of trade to climate change and how trade can help with trade mitigation. And of course, in this context, we assess different tools, including CBAM, domestic taxation based on carbon content, but also the contribution of a specific trade negotiation on climate change mitigation. It turns out that from this evidence-based analysis, CBAM can well perform, both in environmental terms and also in terms of economic and trade performance. So the major surprise for us, because we were quite neutral on CBAM, is that if you collect this CBAM taxation or equivalent to taxation, you can cut the house gas emission from third country about to 4,000 megatons tons of equivalent carbon over the full period for the Fit for 55 package. And this is the least favorable hypothesis of CBAM. And somehow, if you have no retaliation from trading partners, and if you have also the possibility to combine CBAM with subsidies, you can somehow even have a better result in terms of reducing carbon leakage, so reducing house gas emission from third countries, but also, and that is the major lesson we drawn from the study, you could also have a good macroeconomic benefit in terms of growth, employment, and trade if you have the support of subsidies. So you see, if we combine CBAM with a very high level of subsidies, so not only CBAM revenues, but also a part of ETS revenues, into subsidies to the green transition, you have a good outcomes in both terms, growth, employment, and also environmental effects. And this is a simulation made without cumulation with free allowances, but with subsidies. And then we also compare CBAM with a domestic tax, so impacted both domestic and foreign products. And we found out that actually the results were less promising, only a fourth of reduction of climate leakage, and rather bad impact on the economy, even with the accumulation with free allowances. So that's why finally you can see all the findings, and I can share the slides later. We came to the position that we should somehow support CBAM. But of course, the problem with CBAM is that there is a lot of technicalities, nitty-gritties, and of course, it's not an unconditional support for CBAM. So the first point is that we found out that sectors will have different outcome in terms of CBAM. So the sectors who are in the middle of the supply chain, the ones who are spotted by the Commission, are more likely to benefit from CBAM as sectors being downstream. so in the supply chain. So in that sense, we agree with the fact that the Commission started with the sectors who are in the middle of the supply chains and are likely to be the more exposed to carbon leakage. But at the same time, even within this panel of sectors, some sectors are not benefiting from CBAM the way others do. And to take into account these differences between sectors, we suggest that CBAM should be based on a voluntary adherence mechanism. So what we call an opt-in, sectors could choose to be subject to CBAM in the first place. And if we cannot achieve this result, at least that we could have any expansion of CBAM subject to a formal revision of the CBAM directive or regulation. Of course, there is the issue of competitiveness, and I will not dwell on that because we will discuss that later, I guess. So we think that CBAM can have also, if it is not developed with subsidies, can have somehow some issues in terms of competitiveness, especially for export. So our suggestion is twofold. So we need this high level of subsidization for CBAM on the long run to tackle the issue of export competitiveness or outside price concerns. But for the time being, CBAM could be really, let's say, have a very bad outcome for import on the short run. So that's why we advocate for the cumulation with free allowances. And last point, I will be shorter on that. We think that we have also to be very careful on possible circumvention in the application of CBAM. So that's why we pay a lot of attention on the issue of resource shuffling, that the fact that a third country producer could optimize CBAM, trying to have labeled installation for CBAM purpose with green energy and keeping for the rest of the market products that are not CBAM friendly, so to speak. So we need to tackle this. And the last point of our position is that we should develop CBAM with a close dialogue with our trading partners, trying to find ways to avoid trade wars and also double taxation based on carbon content.
Thank you, Mark. Peter, tell me about the chemical industry's views of CBAM.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you for inviting us here to speak for the European chemical industry. The European chemical industry is a big industry. We talk about a turnover of more than 550 billion euros per year, and we support very much the European Green Deal, and we also support the ambition to become carbon neutral by 2050. We see, as we are linked to all other sectors of the European economy, we see us as the chemical industry having a central role in the transformation. We welcome in the CBAM proposal the recognition of a challenge, namely a competitiveness challenge that we face with carbon costs in Europe that are not matched with a similar system outside Europe. So we fully understand where the Commission is coming from, and we have looked at this proposal from our perspective. And maybe I can share a few slides about the nature of our business, which is explaining where we are coming from. So the chemical industry indeed is a sector that is a global player. So if you show the first slide, you can see that we are very much export oriented. Next slide, please. So our trade role in globally is that we are the second largest chemical producer worldwide, only surpassed by the US or even China. And we contribute to the European trade balance some 40 billion every year, maybe it's even more. And there is a tendency of growing exports in this global market. That is why export plays such a big role in our own approach towards CBAM, because we all know the Commission proposal has not considered a solution yet how to deal with exports and export competitiveness. We are very much under pressure here because we can see that our global share in trade has been decreasing over the last 10 years, whereas, for instance, China has grown exponentially in the last 10 years. So Europe is really struggling with the global trade situation, and therefore we need to consider exports. This slide only shows you the main trading partners Europe has, and those would also be potentially the countries that would be affected by a CBAM. So these are our friends, our trading partners, and we have to be very careful what legislation we impose on them, because there is a risk of retaliation, of course. We can say that indeed what Europe sells to our trading partners outside of Europe is very much consumer chemicals and specialty chemicals. And that explains why we are looking at CBAM in a way that we feel value chains need to be considered, because all these specialty chemicals and consumer chemicals would not be considered if you only look at base materials, as the Commission proposal currently does. That means that in a trade situation you could protect base chemicals, but you would be bypassed potentially by these specialty chemicals, consumer chemicals, and that would put the whole value chain of the chemical industry in Europe also at risk. Just one overview that shows we have basic chemicals, we have intermediary chemicals, we have finished chemicals, and they go into all kinds of applications, and that is what we have investigated in a second round. I will tell you a little bit about a study we did with PricewaterhouseCoopers, considering certain value chains and considering what CBAM can achieve or cannot achieve depending on how it is applied. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Killian, Eurometal.
Thanks, Thomas. It's okay. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Killian O'Donoghue. I'm Director of Climate and Energy at Eurometal. So Eurometal represents non-ferrous metals producers, and by non-ferrous metals I'm referring to aluminium, copper, zinc, nickel, etc. And if I speak of Poland, we have KGHM, a rather large mining company, and we also have Umicore, who are investing in battery technologies of tomorrow. So what do we think of CBAM? Before I jump in, just a bit of background on our sector. So with regards to CBAM, aluminium is one of the 5 sectors included in the proposal. I also have lots of other energy intensive sectors like copper, silicon, zinc, nickel, which are not in the initial phase of sectors but should be added at a later stage. So I'm approaching from a perspective of sectors in and sectors that will be added. Just a couple of key facts about our sectors, which is important when I get into our position, is firstly, for metals, it's all about electricity. So 40% of your production cost is just electricity. We're the most electro-intensive sector in Europe. So that's why we focus so much on this issue of scope 2 and indirect emissions. The second issue is demand for metals is rising. That is good. You need more metals in the transition. The issue is European production is going down and it's being replaced with largely Chinese production. That's a particular issue because Chinese production is much more CO2 intensive. If I look at aluminium here, a ton of aluminium in Europe is on average 6.7 tons of CO2. In China it's over 20. So it's 3 times more CO2 intensive. So kind of the more production we have in China, the worse it is for the environment. And the last thing I would just say, it's important to understand that we are what you call a price taker industry. There's one global reference point for metals. So with regards to carbon costs, we cannot pass them on without losing market share. So what do we think of CBAM and how can it be improved? The first thing I should say is we have always been skeptical on the concept of CBAM. We never thought it would work as a concept. It is now on the table, so we're working to improve it and have the best CBAM possible. But I think it's just important to flag that we're never big fans of the system. But moving forward, if we do decide to come on a CBAM, we think 4 elements need to be integrated. First is we think Scope 2 indirect emissions should be excluded until 2030. There's a difference between indirect carbon costs and indirect emissions, and we don't know how to charge indirect carbon costs. This will be less an issue after 2030 when we decarbonize power. So what we say is let's exclude it until 2030. The second element is we need a solution on exports. I think a CBAM makes no sense unless we have a solution on exports. We have had legal advice and we're aware of the difficulties and the challenges with regards to WTO, but we think it can be done in a WTO compatible manner. But long story short, I think CBAM makes no sense unless we have a solution on exports. And I think Peter demonstrated very well from the chemical sector, and I can demonstrate as well from the non-ferrous metal sector. Thirdly, the measure is very weak in terms of its anti-circumvention measures. This is in Article 27 of the proposal, and basically the Commission can only act if there's a slight modification of products. We think that needs to be strengthened. In particular, resource shuffling and cost absorption need to be added. And finally, CBAM for now is only a concept. So I think before we think about things like a phase down, we need to see if we can get the data needed. We need to see if CBAM is effective as a carbon leakage measure. And finally, we need a solution on exports. There should be a phase down, but we don't think before 2030 until we know this works as a carbon leakage system. So I'm going to run through this very fast because I know my time is limited. On this graph here, I would just say the blue is indirect costs and the green is indirect emissions. We don't know how to charge the blue at the border. This would be less an issue after 2030, but until then, until we find a solution, we think we should exclude it. Some proposals say let's charge just based on indirect emissions. If we do so, a carbon-free producer, for example an aluminium plant in Norway producing based on hydro, would face higher CO2 charges than an importing plant from Qatar based on gas. That's a perverse effect, so we say let's exclude Scope 2 until 2030. If sectors say include Scope 2, we say please tell us how to cover indirect carbon costs. Second, this is on exports. When I speak of aluminium, it's about 15% is exported. That's a value of 11 billion. When I expand it to other metals, for example, let's speak about silicone, about 1/3 of the production is exported outside EU. Unless there's a solution on exports, there's no way they're going to be able to compete. As I said, we've had 2 legal studies and there is solutions there. You can do a de facto export adjustment or you can do an export refund option. Basically, what we see is CBAM is a regulatory instrument at the border and it should work both ways. So when you're coming into Europe, you face a CBAM charge, and when you're leaving, there should be a CBAM reduction or something on that for the percentage you export. I think that can be integrated into the overall architecture of the ETS, and that would find a solution on exports. Finally, as I said, the circumvention measures need to be strengthened. Resource shuffling. China, 88% of their aluminium is based on coal, 12% hydro. But that 12% is big enough for the entire European market. So of course China can just say we will certify that we send to Europe the hydro-based aluminium. That means they get around a CBAM, they pay 0 costs implementing, they use the coal domestically or they export it elsewhere. So that's a major weakness and that needs to be tackled. Also cost absorption, that means you only pay a carbon cost and percentage you export. That's just a general flaw of CBAM as a concept. So, you know, if I give the example of aluminium producer, we're paying 100%, we're paying CO2 costs on 100% of our production. If you export 10% to Europe, the exporter is only paying 10% of their production. At the end of the year, if we say €6 a ton, we have 145 million cost of CO2. The exporter has 14.5 million. That's a major difference, and that's just a fundamental flaw of CBAM as a concept. And that's called cost absorption, and that's just integrated into any CBAM design. And finally, we think you should have a testing period and a review mechanism. We are now collecting data, and it's important to say that the Commission is still deciding what data has to be submitted by importers, and that's not decided yet. So when when Chinese, Russians submit data now, we're not sure how it should be designed, what exactly they have to give. The second is we have to see if CBAM is effective in terms of carbon leakage. Is it an effective tool? And finally, we need a solution on exports. And until then, we think we should pause the phase down, assess it, and then after 2030, if we find a solution to these things, we can have a phase out and we've gradually moved towards a CBAM. That's all from my side, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Killian. Karsten, so we've heard the industry speak. Now tell me, how do you look at CBAM and what do you see there as an academic studying the economic aspects of decarbonization?
Thanks for the invite, Tomasz. I think if you go one step back, we've got now in Glasgow global commitments towards climate neutrality. Many countries, the European Union, committing to climate neutrality, also many firms. But I think what we are missing, particularly in basic materials, are the incentives, the financial framework for companies actually to move to climate neutral production, to more recycling, to more material efficiency. I think this is struggling and in the way, particularly if you look at the financial sector. The financial sector funds companies and they request that companies are moving to climate neutrality. So it will be very difficult to finance conventional technologies, and at the same time we are missing the framework for climate neutral technologies and more material efficiency, more recycling. So we're in a limbo in between. So business as usual is not an option. And I think this is particularly disconcerting at the time of the gas prices and electricity prices, where even more so sites are under risk right now. So against this background, I think we have a unique opportunity with a Green Deal to really tackle this challenge and to move us into the next decade, into the 2030s, to make sure that we get the investment across Europe that we need in basic materials. And I feel the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the ideas behind it are certainly a core component of this. We need to have a European decarbonization strategy, industry strategy that works by itself and gives us a strong negotiation mandate to discuss with other continents and countries alliances on carbon pricing. But it has to work by itself, otherwise we are not a strong negotiator. And I think that's why the idea, the philosophy of a CBAM is a nice starting point to say we can have a carbon price which is crucial for industry, where we talk about commodities, that works in Europe. And I think it is striking that we look at this 70 years after the European Union of coal and steel was set up. That was the foundation of the European Union, was looking at basic commodities like steel and coal at that time, and how to make an integrated market, how to kind of address social aspects, how to provide resources from a European scale to member states to make this integration, modernization at that time. So it's a new modernization agenda that we're looking for. And we don't have at the moment the framework that allows this to happen. We have an emissions trading system in place which grants all allowances for free, and we've been working on this for 15 years now. My sense is it gives very limited incentives for climate neutral production, for material efficiency and for recycling, the three pillars of moving to climate neutrality. So let me just go through all three of them to see what is needed. If we talk about climate neutrality, we're talking about clean production processes for steel, cement, plastics. They are more expensive than conventional technologies. Overall, at our societal level, that's not much, but for the specific companies, that's a lot. And that's why we need policy frameworks that allow companies to make this shift. In the absence of a European framework, we see France, Netherlands, now the coalition agreement in Germany, provide national funding for industry to make this transition. But we don't want national approaches, and these countries don't want national approaches. They prefer a European approach. So we need a European scale instrument to allow us to really make this transition at the European scale. If we think about material efficiency, Central and Eastern European countries have been really successful over the last 2 decades advancing energy efficiency. There was very cheap energy in the past, and therefore very limited energy efficiency, and a lot of progress in Central and Eastern European countries on energy efficiency. Now we're at the same stage with materials. Many materials, basic materials, are still very cheap. We don't have any price, carbon price reflected in there. So if we want to use these materials more efficiently, if we want to get less import dependent on basic materials, that's our biggest carbon input is basic material, raw materials, then we need to have a carbon price on basic material use to get these incentives right. And if you look at recycling, again, We don't hardly recycle plastic or cement right now. Again, we can make recycling possible there if you have a business case, and again, there's a carbon price that is needed. And the CBAM file, in principle, really offers the opportunity to do so. And we've seen now 2 years of discussions of how it could be done, and many hopes that it could cover imports, exports, the value chain. And I think now it's really for the Parliament to discuss which design choice to use to make this happen, which allows an effective carbon price that we need for the modernization in Europe.
Thank you, Carsten. So it seems, when I was listening to all of you, it seems that one of the big issues was the impact of CBAM on competitiveness. I mean, as we discussed, we see some advantages of it. Of course, CBAM in some ways equalizes the playing field of the domestic industry towards imports. But there is a concern that all of you shared on the impact that CBAM can have on your overall competitiveness, which of course is a bit surprising considering it's supposed to, in theory, avoid carbon leakage. So I wanted to ask each of you now just to delve a little bit on this impact of CBAM as it is proposed now on competitiveness, including on exports. Killian, maybe let's start with you. You've touched on it a little bit, but if you can go a little deeper.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is when the concept of CBAM came out, we were quite open to the idea in the sense that as Europe, we decided to go from 40 to 55%. So we thought, okay, we're increasing ambition. We imagine we're going to increase carbon leakage protection, a reciprocal kind of measure. So that was kind of the idea. And then what we seen, was that CBAM was seen as an alternative to the current measures, and then moreover we're seeing that CBAM will not have a solution on exports. So from our side, the proposal we think would have a very negative impact on the competitiveness of our sector. As I said, our sector is very much based on electricity, and that's based for all the non-ferrous metals. So I think we need to maintain the system of indirect cost compensation to 2030. Also, I think with regards to CBAM, if we were to include Scope 2 emissions, there would be no way we would be able to compete. And that's simply because we're paying indirect costs and the importer only have to face indirect emissions. And for ourselves, there's no way we could compete. With regards to the export markets, it's very clear that unless we have a solution on exports, we will not be able to export outside Europe. If I give the example of silicone, as I said, we export 1/3 outside Europe. CO2 costs, both direct and indirect, so Scope 1 and Scope 2, are just over 900 euros a ton of silicone. The price of silicone is 2,000 euros at the exchange, so about almost 50% of your cost is CO2. If you don't have an export solution, there's no way that 33% is going to be exported outside Europe. So that's just one example. And final thing I would just say, in terms of downstream products, they're going to get more expensive. I like the solution proposed by Mark, that downstream sectors would have some compensation, but also that's what we see. If we have a CBAM without significant changes, so maintaining free allowances and export solutions, the downstream products are going to get much, much more expensive. I think that's clear.
And just to clarify, so for your sector, is it mostly the free allowance is the sort of the issue, or is it the indirect ETS compensation that's the main issue?
It's very much the indirect compensation. So 4/5, 80% of our emissions are Scope 2 emissions. So for us, it's all about electricity, as I said. And we should be open to a CBAM because, as I said, we have a much lower footprint in Europe. So it should be an advantage for us vis-a-vis people exporting to Europe. But we just don't see how it can be designed to our advantage. So you would think we should be the biggest supporter of a CBAM, but having looked at the proposal, we just don't see how it can work.
Okay, well, some tough news.
If I can just add one point on that, as Thomas asked, we're very much the electricity side of things, but other sectors, for example, Peter's sector or the steel sector, they're going to electrify more and become like non-ferrous metals as we go forward. So we need to find good incentives for electrification of industry. And if the most electro-intensive sector is saying this is a big concern, electrification is not good for other sectors or to incentivize other sectors to follow the electrification lead. I think that's important to say.
Well, That's an excellent point, because as we know, the Commission actually shortened the list of sectors entitled to indirect ETS compensation, and that was a big concern for all of the sectors that have to electrify, right? But maybe that's a good segue actually into chemicals. Peter, you've already mentioned the study that you did with PwC. We've just discussed the indirect ETS compensation, which the chemical sector was also hit by. So please.
Yes, thank you, Tomasz. Indeed. As you will know, the chemical industry is not yet fully in the scope of this CBAM proposal. It's only fertilizers and ammonia, and others are not yet included. What I would like to say is, maybe we can also show the slides that I promised you. We have looked at the CBAM proposal in a constructive manner. We see the good intentions, and of course we also see that there are some limitations. What concerns especially the value chains, but also what concerns indirect emissions, and Kilian just mentioned it. My sector is planning to decarbonize very much in many technologies by electrifying the processes, and that of course has an issue, because electricity contains a carbon cost, and as long as this is not compensated, there is little incentive to make this transition. So we need to consider this. We have worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and we have looked at some 5 value chains and very different applications in end products to see, well, what can CBAM do and how could it be implemented. So, as I said, a constructive approach, and we looked at applications like consumer goods, automotive, construction and packaging, and we looked at these different streams of products that have endless number of intermediates and end products. And PricewaterhouseCoopers used the known carbon content in these products, the production costs, transport costs, profitability of these products. They looked at trade, so what is imported, what is exported, how big is the market, and then we came up with a comparison of different options. What could a CBAM look like? And on the left side you see the current European Commission proposal, which is complementary to the emissions trading system. Then we have thought of a complete CBAM where we also consider indirect costs, where we also consider exports. Then we have looked at a more restrictive CBAM where we cover exports, but we don't have free allocation. And then we have also looked at Carsten's climate contribution approach, where basically the carbon cost is collected with the end consumer. So what we found in terms of the effect on the European budget, which is one key motivation to introduce CBAM, is that basically there is a similar level of income for Europe from either having a complete CBAM or a climate contribution. It's the same, whereas it's a little bit lower when you look at the complementary system as proposed by the European Commission. So it doesn't make such a big difference, but of course, as we see in terms of competitiveness, there is a very big effect with relatively minor differences in the income from the carbon content. You basically protect an enormous amount of exports from carbon leakage. So we are here talking about exports of these value chains that we have looked at, worth some 70 billion euros. We have looked at what these CBAMs can do, and on the right side you see so-called heat maps, where we have, for example, looked at PVC pipes that are already under competitive pressure in Europe. That's the left map, where you see, well, it's a relatively warm color showing that these products are already now at a high risk of carbon leakage. When you apply the restrictive CBAM as proposed by the Commission, well, you take away a little bit of the heat of competitiveness pressures, but the comprehensive solution, that is a complete CBAM or a carbon contribution as proposed by Professor Neuhoff, then of course you have established a level playing field for these products. So in summary, we would say you need to include all emissions, not only direct emissions. You should also look at downstream products, and you have to include exports. All of these things make an effective CBAM. Thank you.
Peter, sorry, but I'm looking at the comprehensive solution. Even then, parts of Europe are still exposed.
Yes, that is then less an effect of the carbon cost, but it's also, there are also other competitive pressures, of course, like the cost of raw materials, the cost of energy, that make it a fact that European production is already now exposed to competitiveness pressures.
Yeah, this is an important point, right? CBAM alone, even with climate contribution, it's not going to resolve all the competitive issues of the European industry. But okay, moving forward, Mark, we've had two sectors speak. You have a sort of cross-sector association. I've taken a look at your at AFEP's document, the priorities for the French presidency, and you have three big points. The first one is boosting low carbon investments in Europe. So that's the first one. The second one is ensure playing field. And the third one is enhance the European territory's attractiveness for to sustain investment and employment. So my question to you is this: the CBAM, the way it is proposed, do you think that achieves the sort of the three big things that you've set out, or is there room for improvement?
No, I said there is clearly a room for improvement. Because of this dynamic of decarbonization. As we said, it's very crucial that the package, the climate package, comes along with a huge public investment effort. Of course, in, let's say, public goods, public infrastructures, but also in supporting the effort made by the private sector to shift to a decarbonized industry. I mean, what the other panelists said was very straightforward. In all sectors, they will need to invest in electrification, in low carbon intensive production processes. It has a cost, and private funding will not be enough. So we have to have this huge investment effort to be made in parallel with CBAM. And our study made with the macroeconomic model shows that actually that makes a difference in terms of economic performance for CBAM. But it's something that will show results only after 10 to 15 years. And we have to live in between. And the problem that we see with CBAM as it is proposed, so with the progressive dismantlement of free allowances, is that our industries, from a cross-sectoral basis, will be subject to a kind of a scissor effect. It's possible that the carbon prices go up much quicker than thought or imagined by the European Commission. We have energy prices being very volatile with a lot of changes. So to face the situation, we need something to back the competitiveness of EU companies on the short run. And of course, the legal debate is open. There are many discussions currently on what is WTO compatible or not WTO compatible. But what we clearly see is that it is very difficult to design something that could be WTO compatible if you target exports. Export contingent subsidies are clearly prohibited under the WTO. And from a legal perspective, at least, we see that finally the accumulation with free allowances is certainly one of the safest options. it is certainly debatable. There can be challenges in WTO, but at least it's less obvious. There is no obvious prohibition as if you target exports. So that's why we see it as a good solution. Instead of this progressive dismantlement, we should envisage, at least for the 10 first years of CBAM implementation, that we could have this cumulation with free allowances. We see it also as a solution, a partial solution for downstream sectors. I would somehow agree partially with the conclusion of the Pricewaterhouse study that on the whole, on the macroeconomic perspective, CBAM is a better solution for all sectors than CBAM limited to the mid-range of the supply chain. But nonetheless, downstream sectors will be more negatively impacted by CBAM than sectors in the middle of the supply chain. So we need to tackle this. So first of all, many downstream sectors actually rely both on domestic consumptions and both on imports for their input. So if you allow for the accumulation of free allowances, basically it will help them cope with the cost on the internal market. And for the part of imports targeted by CBAM, indeed we advocate for a special compensation mechanism that would help them absorb the cost without downgrading their competitiveness on the internal market on export as well. Okay.
So, well, we'll come back to all of these issues in our next round, but now I want to go to Karsten, because Karsten's actually researched some of this stuff. You've researched the impact of carbon border mechanisms on the competitiveness of the EU industry. You've done some research, and actually I think one of your papers is quoted in the impact assessment for CBAM, so congratulations on that. But please tell us what you found.
Yeah. So I think we've seen all this discussion for what is possible on CBAM design. And for my senses, there's a certain trade-off one is looking for. If we delay the implementation and have a longer period of free allowance allocation, we also delay all the investment incentives for climate neutrality, material efficiency and recycling. And we can't afford this. If, however, we very quickly would move to a full CBAM and full auctioning, then we have significant cost increases that are not compensated at the export level. And we looked at this: if you, for example, have by 2030 50% of auctioning, 50% free allocation, have carbon price levels of 60 euro, then roughly 10% of European exports would face cost increases of 5% of more relative to gross value added. So could be at some level considered at risk of carbon leakage as a first proxy. This then raises really the question, how do we strike this balance? And I think we've been trying to do this for the last 15 years in the emissions trading system with the discussion of free allowance allocation. And with this network climate strategies, we've done a lot of different studies on elements around it with partners across Europe. And you can look at the summary on the slides, but let me just come back to what is the alternative way of implementing a CBAM. And as you mentioned, the European Commission has been looking at many CBAM design options. My sense is if you look at a CBAM design that looks at the carbon intensity of imported goods, then what is on the table is probably the best balance one can find. What happens if you look at something which uses default values? Does this offer us alternative options? And also this was assessed and was relatively positively assessed by the European Commission in its impact assessment, and very positive in the support studies that were made before that. It uses then established instruments, I'll show them to you in a second, which meet administrative and WTO requirements for a good implementation. What it does not do, it does not create incentives for third countries to implement climate action, to implement carbon pricing, or to implement mitigation efforts in third countries. So this is something we wouldn't then use the CBAM mechanism for. We've been successful in triggering the discussions, but we would use other mechanisms, instruments, cooperation elements to go forward. And I think the COP in Glasgow has shown climate alliances as tools where countries already want to move together. So there are three elements to consider. And one step back, the elements relate to basic material production. So that's basic steel, basic chemicals, aluminium, copper, cement, clinker, 5, 6, 7 substances that would be affected. They're very discrete. However, they're responsible for 25% of global CO2 emissions. So it is worthwhile to look at them because they are really the big chunk of emissions and the big area where we need the modernization going forward. So looking at the example of steel, if we produce 1 ton of steel, we produce 1.8 tons of CO2 emissions with the best available technology and 1.9, so 2 tons with less efficient technologies. They would be continued to be responsible for their emissions under the European emissions trading system, but would continue to obtain free allocation for the transition period until climate neutrality if the companies present plans how they want to make this transition to climate neutrality at this full benchmark of conventional technologies. At the same time, every ton of steel produced is liable for a climate contribution which is calculated at the benchmark level times the carbon price. So it's precisely the pricing that is lost through the free allocation that is reinstated to give the full incentives for material efficiency and for recycling and the revenues that we need for the transition pathway forward and social compensation. So all the incentives are in place. Climate neutral production processes, they have inherently higher costs and will likely have them in the future. So these processes would obtain carbon contracts for differences that cover the incremental cost, are negotiated at the stage and auction later on of building this plant, so they give investment certainty to make this investment wave happen across Europe. And these carbon contracts for differences are funded through the climate contribution, which is also levied on climate neutral as much as conventional processes because of WTO requirements, but also to get the revenue scale that we need. And finally, this means conventional technologies are subject to the climate contribution. Clean technologies are subject to the climate contribution. It's an excise charge. So also imports have to pay for the climate contribution. Whether you import a ton of steel or steel as part of a car, you have to report how many kilograms of steel, how many kilograms of aluminium are in this product, and the benchmark, the default value of the climate contribution applies. If you now use excise systems, they are established in the WTO, then you can use duty suspension schemes that allows you to pass on this liability to pay to the value chain. So the car manufacturer doesn't pay for steel that has paid the liability, but takes the steel from the steel producer. And if now the car producer wants to export a car, the liability can be waived. This means this liability is only due where the products are sold domestically, so we have full balancing of the carbon pricing from this climate contribution, and therefore have no distortions of trade from the system. So let me summarize. This concept of a climate contribution is another way of implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It ensures the ETS price signal creates incentives for efficient material use and recycling. It secures the funding at the same time for climate neutral production processes. Their incremental costs can be covered from this climate contribution. And it works for the value chain by using the default value and therefore allowing to cover all imports and waiving the liability for this climate contribution at the side of exports in a way that is fully compatible with WTO and established practice already in Europe and many parts of the world. It's a pragmatic way to catalyze this transition to climate neutrality now. It meets the European objectives of the carbon border adjustment mechanism and gives particularly now important investors a perspective that European investment frameworks are there. It's worthwhile to invest in plants now to make them happen, to make them more efficient, to use materials and all the elements that we can use. And at the same time, it offers a global reach. First of all, it's a way of Europe implementing its commitment we made in Glasgow towards moving towards climate neutrality. Secondly, it shows an approach is viable and gives other countries and continents options to kind of move forward on this approach. And therefore also puts Europe in a very strong negotiation position towards taking forward these climate alliances. And as soon as we get stronger in climate alliances with other parts of the world, have a common carbon price agreed on them, then the free allocation, the climate contribution, and the carbon contracts for differences can be reduced correspondingly. So it's a way of catalyzing the transition to climate neutrality now already, making modernization happen now. And then in the longer term, we can move towards the system that has been proposed by the Commission, but not as a unilateral approach, but as a multilateral approach with other major trading partners together. Back to you.
Okay, Carsten, so to summarize, basically what you're proposing is the following. We keep ETS the way more or less it is now. So producers keep paying ETS, they keep getting free allowances the way it is now. To this we add basically a climate contribution, which I guess is a carbon consumption tax in a way. So that's domestically. At the border, we keep the border adjustment mechanism more or less the way it is, with the one exception that the way it's calculated changes. It doesn't really matter anymore how much the exporter emits. We just calculate CBAM at the benchmark level times ETS price. And we use the climate contribution from the imports and from the domestic sales by the domestic industry to fund contracts for difference. That's more or less.
People working in the policy space are always far better in explaining than we on the academic side. Yes.
But that's it in a nutshell. Okay. Okay. So let's discuss this now. Peter, I know that CEFIC's been working a little bit on this proposal. You've already discussed it a little bit. So where do you see the advantages of it vis-a-vis the CBAM as it is now, and what do you see the main challenges to implementing this proposal, but also in general to the CBAM the way it is now?
Yes, indeed, the chemical industry is used to the system that we have in Europe, the European emissions trading system, and we are just about to reform it once more after the last wave of reforms has just been done in 2018, and we now will work with the European Parliament, with Mrs. Klotz as well, to improve the system further and to adapt it to the new ambition. And I would like to say that the free allocation system has worked until now to preserve the European industry competitiveness together with indirect compensation. So there is a good experience, a positive experience, and that is why we also support the European emissions trading system very much. So it gives a price to carbon, it reaches the agreed ambition and the agreed emission reductions at the lowest cost by trading. That's a system we understand, that's a system we know. With CBAM now, of course, we have raised some issues that we would like to be resolved, and I would like to stress also that, as Carsten Neuhoff said, WTO compatibility is an important value. We don't see it yet how it can be resolved, but we believe that indeed free allocation for exports could be a means, could be compatible with the WTO law and rules. But we also see, of course, the complexity of such a system. We have the European Customs Union, where already now national authorities interpret this in very different ways, and a CBAM or also a carbon contribution will add more complexity to the customs regime that we already have. So what we need to really achieve is a system where we enable exporters, importers, producers to work with the system and to comply with it in a way that is transparent and fair. And that is true for customs, that is true for the calculation of carbon contents. So it's a big challenge, and we are a little bit concerned that the Commission at the moment doesn't have many details how this could be done, and that a lot would be left to comitology or to Commission working groups that sort out all these very important details after the legislation has been agreed. So we would feel more comfortable if there was more content also in the legislative proposal to indeed determine these important details upfront, rather than leave it up to well, processes that are less democratic and less transparent, and that may not answer all these questions properly.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Killian, not to you. What is your view on this climate contribution proposal? But I also wanted to ask actually each of the panels this question as well, because we're here mostly, let's face it, this is mostly the business. We don't have the European Commission, we don't have here the, let's say, the green side of the parliament. One of the big arguments that the Commission always raises, and rightly so, is that the EU ETS system we're combined with free allowances, that it doesn't motivate the industry to decarbonize as much as it should. I mean, that is a point that the Commission makes quite often, and it's partially valid point. So if our sort of solution to the export competitiveness problem is keeping free allowances, we need to somehow address this point of motivation to decarbonize. And I guess part of the proposal here is that the climate contribution will actually force the industry to move away from the emitting raw materials into something that's into raw materials that are more climate friendly. So how would we address this point?
Okay, so I'm going to first react to Carsten's presentation, then on that. So on Carsten's presentation, I would say we like the idea by and large. We think climate contribution makes sense. I would just compliment Carsten as well, because it's one thing to come with an idea, it's another thing to push it and put it on the table. I think you've done an excellent job of pushing the debate in Brussels. Just on the design, on the technicalities and then the political side. On the technicalities, as metals, when we analyze the proposal, we think that one default value for product is maybe not the best way, that maybe you could separate default values between regions. Because as I said, in Europe, aluminium is 3 times less CO2 intensive than China. So the default value should be one for Europe, one for other regions. We think that would be interesting. And a second element is it's good to put a value in kind of how much the product is recycled. Aluminium, over 90% of aluminium ever produced is still in use today. If we contrast with plastics, no offense, Peter, it's a much higher rate. So that's what we think of climate contribution. On the political side, Thomas, you called it a consumption tax. We read it similar to consumption tax, which would require unanimity. I know, Carsten, you said that actually you think it can be done through QMV. If that is the case, of course, we're interested. But if it's unanimity, it's very unlikely to happen. That's something that I have to say. For example, if we look at taxation, electricity is taxed more than gas in Europe today, which makes no sense. But the reason is we can't change the taxation rules given unanimity. I'm Irish. We have very low tax rates for some companies. It's not going to change because at EU level, tax is a member state competence. So that is a very big obstacle we see in the idea. But of course, we're happy to discuss. So on incentives, free allowances, and indirect cost compensation. So first on free allowances, what I would say as metals, and I think as all industry, we always said that this decade is the key decade for the kind of breakthrough technologies to take place. And what that means is you invest a lot in technologies that come online probably after 2030. But in order for them to be interesting, you need a level playing field on carbon today. If we had a price of carbon of €30 a ton, that's basically 19% of aluminium price. Now we're 60 today, it's €80 a ton, that's 40% of aluminium price. So if we're paying 40% of the sales cost and no one else is, then of course there's no way we can invest on the innovation technologies that we need for tomorrow. So what we say, free allowances are not forever, but we kind of say to 2030, let's have a level playing field with regards carbon costs and the free allowances. It's important to understand that you only get full allocation for the benchmark, which is the best performer. Everyone else pays high CO2 costs. There's also digressive reduction factors, benchmarks, etc. So no one's getting 100% free allowances. It's usually about 70%. When I speak of some sectors, it's about 50%. That's the reality. Then just on indirect cost compensation, because there's a bit of a misunderstanding what we see in the European Parliament today. So what you have is the ETS sends the signal, the direct impact on the power sector to switch from coal to gas, etc. So the power sector is decarbonizing, and we've done very well there. So that is the ETS signal. Indirect cost compensation, what that does is it says there's certain sectors that are very exposed to international competition because they're very electro-intensive. So what it does is it allows the power sector to decarbonize and allows electro-intensive sectors to survive that transition. It doesn't disincentivize power decarbonization, and it's very similar to what we do with renewables. We basically said that renewables, we're going to push them and we're going to integrate more renewables into the system, but we're going to have a system like we have for the state aid guidelines where industries exposed to competition will not have to bear the full cost of renewables. And what we've seen is we introduced that system, we had a huge uptake of renewables, cost has gone down. During the transition, industry was able to survive, and now industries are cost competitive. And that's what indirect cost compensation is. So I think it's important to make that distinction. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark, anything you want to respond to the climate contribution proposal and some of the points that were made? That's number one. But I also, after we're done with that, I also wanted to ask you about France, because of course France will now be, well, it is important, but it will be even more important as it takes over the presidency of the Council for half a year. We have the French Renew Group, which is quite influential, especially on the climate issues, because it is somewhere in the middle-ish. We have, of course, the French chair of the Envy Committee. So the next half a year, when a lot of these files will be getting finalized, France will be very important. So if you can touch a little bit about the discussion in France and how do you see the French position on these issues?
Yes, first on the climate contribution, I agree that it is very seductive as it is proposed. We see some merit of it, of course, in terms of revenue, because if you have a tax levied both on domestic products and imports, you will mechanically collect much more revenue from it. And we see, and also in our own study, we saw that it would be very beneficial for downstream sectors. From a global perspective, we have some doubt whether it is as effective as the CBAM, both in terms of reducing the carbon leakage in third countries. I could show back the slides, but we saw that the proportion of the reduction of emission in third countries is much less important with an horizontal tax than compared with the CBAM. And of course, and to plug it back to the political debate, as you may know, and before I move to France's position, the issue of taxation relying directly on the consumer proved very touchy and complex. So, and if we put it back in the overall context of the package, we will have this huge debate on the extension, the new ETS on transport and housing sector. We will have again this debate whether we can agree to have the consumer paying the bill for these new sectors under the ETS. And if you add a new component that will rely directly on the consumer, it might be very difficult to negotiate. But of course, nothing is cast in stone. We rely on what our constituencies, our membership will give us in terms of signal in the course of CBAM. Maybe we can explore whether CBAM could be combined with the climate contribution. The sectors subject to the high level of carbon leakage could be subject to CBAM, while downstream sectors could be subject to climate contribution. This is one of the many options. And now moving to the French position, well, as you may know, it is somehow in an idea the CBAM has been somehow crafted partially in France, so there is a strong appetite on the side of the French government to have CBAM moving ahead during the French presidency and to cast some political agreement, or at least to have a first consensus on CBAM. I think the reason why the French government has been for almost 1 decade now so keen to insist on CBAM was the idea to have a level playing field on carbon, on the contribution in terms of climate change. So this is a strong driver. There is also the idea that from an environmental perspective you need to have a price signal, and to have a price signal relying on importers is also very important in the economical logic of CBAM. So I think that will be one of the key elements in the French position on CBAM. That being said, of course, the French government as a whole is also very sensitive to the issue of competitiveness, is fully aware on the issue of export competitiveness in particular. So I think that has to be factored in the debate. For the time being, our perception is that the Renew group is still very aligned with this thinking. But again, the Renew group is also very sensitive to the issue of export fragility. So I hope that in the debate there will be some adjustment, and that's also as a final word, I would of course insist that the industry should gather. Have our point being very understood by the public authorities, and we keep insisting on all the complexity of CBAM proposal, rolling out the CBAM proposal, and to find some fix to the competitiveness issues.
Okay, before I give it back to Carsten to sort of respond to some of the issues, I just wanted to throw in one more thing to the mix. When the industry goes to the Commission and complains essentially that CBAM, the way it is proposed with the withdrawal of free allowances and indirect ETS compensation, is going to affect export competitiveness, the Commission responds, they say more or less 2 or 3 things. One thing they say, well, look, that's only far in the future, so don't worry about it now. So that's the first thing. The second thing they say, and it's not really set out very clearly in the impact assessment, but when you analyze what's happening, you realize exports are going to go down, but also imports are supposed to go down, and the output of CBAM industries is supposed to go up. So what that really means in practical terms is that the Commission is pushing for an import substitution scheme where we push exports out and the domestic industry focuses on the domestic market. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond. I don't know if anybody wants to take it. I see Killian really wants to do it. So
yeah, it's a very good point. I don't want to be too direct, but I think that argumentation from the Commission, it's rubbish. It doesn't make sense.
It's quite direct.
I think obviously you have to sell a concept that you come with, and CBAM region was an idea, 55%, and then I think now we realize, okay, there's a big challenge in exports, so we're trying to sell, say, oh, this will happen, this will happen. I think first thing we need to do with CBAM is we are considering this being the carbon leakage measure. So the argument by the Commission that, oh, the sectors included at the beginning don't export as much as Peter's sector later, that doesn't apply. Because we're moving towards this measure, we have a certain list of sectors at the beginning and others will be added later. So all sectors are going to be part of this system. So we need to look at it that you're including export-orientated sectors and also import-orientated sectors. So I think that's what we have to look at CBAM. And then the argumentation that, oh, you will gain domestic market, all these kind of things, it doesn't work like that. We're really throwing away our export markets unless we find a solution here. And you can kind of sell it any way you like, but that is just the reality. So I don't want to be too direct, but that's how we see it.
Peter, do you want to?
What we see with regard to chemicals consumption and the chemical market in Europe, it's a rather stable situation, whereas we expect the global chemicals demand possibly double until 2030. So it is really a stretch for the Commission to tell a European industry, well, this growth outside of Europe, forget about it. You concentrate on the European market and you will be living happily ever after. This is not the case. And for export-oriented industries, of course, losing export means also losing capacity utilization rates of your domestic manufacturing. And we are talking huge operations, some of which consume as much electricity as a whole country. And if you consider, well, we lose 5% or 7% because we don't have export anymore, then the whole fabric of manufacturing is put into question, because we all are interlinked, and there are huge synergies being used in these complex production sites. So it is, you put at risk what you have and what you can develop. You also put at risk the investment perspective domestically. If you say, well, whatever growth happens outside Europe, not anymore our concern, we invest for the European market. That is not a good perspective for investors, for sure.
Thank you. Carsten, do you want to respond to any of the points that were made here about climate contribution? Obviously, I do want to highlight, and I share a little bit the point that Killian made about, and I think we discussed it already before, the point about procedural aspects of it, the probable unanimity required. I understand there is some doubt about that. There's also the sort of the procedural aspects of how to accommodate this quite a revolutionary in a legislative sense concept with a Fit for 55 package, which is already rolling for the Parliament.
Lots of good points. I think I would like to start with this question in terms of aligning with the current discourse and political objectives. I feel it really is a question of sequencing. Ultimately, we are looking for a climate alliance of major economies working together, having converging to a common carbon price. And to get to this alliance, I think someone has to start and show it works and show that the carbon pricing system works. And I think that's somehow what we can kickstart here, catalyze by adding the climate contribution to our European emissions trading system now. And I think then we are can go out and discuss with other countries. Let's make a carbon pricing club, that's what we want to call it in Germany. I think in Glasgow it was called Alliance, and work together on this, and then also have a multilateral approach to a carbon pricing approach, which I think makes it far more effective. And then we effectively combine different perspectives that are on the table now. In terms of procedural, I think, as mentioned, all of the options were part of the impact assessment, of the support studies. So in a way, implementing whichever way is still very much in the discretionary choice now of Parliament and the Council. And as you pointed out, much of the detail is actually in the implementing regulation, in the comitology. So it doesn't require many structural major changes. It's another way of implementing something, as you described it, far more elegantly in terms of describing how it works. Now, in terms of does it require anonymity? Our studies suggest, with the lawyers, I'm an economist associated with it, that it is an environmental regulation. We have an emissions trading system as an environmental regulation, which currently has the carbon price incentive largely muted for the majority of mitigation options, investment options that we need. So you reinstate this effective carbon price signal. And I think that, combined with the elements of the benchmark, the carbon price from the ETS, and from, at the same time, the use of revenues, really makes it very clearly part of the ETS directive as an environmental regulation with qualified majority voting in the Parliament. Finally, for me, the interesting question that you brought up in terms of issues people have, what does it mean for consumers? Any system that we have which has higher cost production, perhaps if you move to climate neutral processes, or because we have some charges, ultimately consumers will have to pay. And I don't want to talk actually about consumers in the case of materials. We want to go to circularity, so it's about users of material, and they kind of use it over and over again. It largely creates incentives for manufacturing industry and for construction industry. That's where the price signal matters. For final consumers, if you go to a carbon price of 60 euros, then total expenditure of poor households increased by less than 0.4%. Richer households a bit more. But poor households just don't buy that many things that are material intensive. So actually it's quite a politically attractive distribution effect if these costs incur ultimately, and we'll incur them in any way that we do. And then let's find a way that creates as limited costs as possible by limiting investment costs with a carbon contract for differences, by avoiding windfall profits through direct output-based allocation. And I think ultimately this will be the lowest cost system, if you look at the details for consumers across Europe, to move towards climate neutrality.
Killian?
If I can just, if I can just follow on from one thing there, as Carsten touched on, I think a big thing we're missing in the whole debate is this creating a demand for low carbon products. I think that's really important. And with decarbonization, you have push factors, which is the ETS, and you have pull factors, which is creating demand. But the latter has not really been discussed. I think we really need to create a market for low carbon products. The challenge we see is obviously the relationship between base materials and customers is different from many other things. For example, vegetables. You go to a supermarket, you can buy bio vegetables 20% more expensive, but you know it and you can make that decision. When you buy a car, you don't know where the aluminium comes from, but we need to have some certification and some incentive so a customer can say, I'm buying a carbon-free aluminium car, I'm paying 20% more, but I can do it. And I think that's something we really need to crack, and that to some extent is on the Commission to create this market for low carbon products. I just wanted to add that.
We still have a few minutes, so we can go a little deeper in this, because when we say we need to create a market for low carbon products, somewhere at the end of that is a high price, right? Because basically what will most likely happen is that low carbon products will be expensive. And that goes back to this issue of who's going to essentially pay for it, and how do we explain it to the citizens that, sorry, the food that you are, for example, that food you were paying for so much now is going to be twice as expensive, the car is going to be more expensive, and so on. So then the question probably, and this is a question to all of you, is how can Europe actually support creating that market for low carbon products? How?
Well, actually, we are rather on the supply side, so to speak. So we think that actually, of course, we need to think of how the consumer can be incentivized to buy these low carbon products, but before we have to have the technologies. So it's a huge industrial undertaking in the EU, because we are in a world competition. The US are spending an incredible amount of money on creating these new technologies, and the package discussed currently in the Congress includes a lot of funding for that. Maybe it will create new trade irritants with the EU, because the idea is also to give money for the consumers to buy electric cars. But you see, there is a huge effort to put domestic industry at the level of the challenges ahead in terms of decarbonization. China, of course, no need to expend too much on that. China is doing the same effort since decades now. Of course, they keep having very carbon-intensive sectors, but at the same time, they are now up to speed on solar panel, on windmills. So we have to make the same effort, and this should start with the supply side, so help the EU industry to develop these new technologies and to buy them in other sectors.
Karsten, you were nodding your head.
I think we fully echo this. I think in Europe, we don't have the capacity to raise more European budget to fund this transition. Some rich member states have the budget to do it, and they will, because of citizens' demand, do it nationally if necessary. But we have the European emissions trading system, which I think is going to be the finance instrument for the transition to climate neutrality. And then the demand side comes in through labeling, through sustainable finance, and I think in the mid and long term through product carbon requirements. At some point, you are just not allowed to sell carbon-intensive products anymore in Europe or another part of the world. So I think it is all about making sure that our industry can make this transition, because if in countries it can't make the transition, then probably it has to shut down at some point. And I think that's why I'm very strongly interested to find a way that is European, so all European industry jobs can make this transition. And that's where I see the unique opportunity with this ETS now, because I don't see the scale of resources necessary otherwise. We have the Innovation Fund. It was 25 times oversubscribed. So we don't have the resources right now to do it at the European scale. And if we don't get this system implemented now, in the context of the CBAM, in a way of raising sufficient revenues to make this happen, from products to make products sustainable, I'm really worried about what this means for our industry transition at the European scale.
Okay, and now one final question. Or did you want to?
Yes.
Sorry.
If I may, I would like to echo Mark's comment on the need for innovation. We don't have answers for all technological challenges yet. So we need innovation, and we need to change processes and replace fossil raw materials, fossil fuels, wherever we can. On the way, to getting there, we also need enormous amounts of carbon-free or low-carbon electricity, which needs to be provided, which needs to be really affordable and available when we need it. And that is also a challenge. We have ambitions, but we don't have all the answers yet. So that is why we believe we need an innovation wave, and for that we also need funding. And indeed, I agree, part of it could come from the ETS, and ideally those funds should really be recycled to the sectors that are part of the ETS, and they should not move somewhere else into the budgets. That is a key element as well. So electrification is a way for my industry to move away from established processes to reduce emissions dramatically. However, we don't see yet where this electricity will be coming from in the required amounts.
Thank you. We have 30 seconds, so I want each of you just to tell me the CBAM proposal envisages that we will have a CBAM by the 1st of January next year. No, not next year, sorry, the following year, 23. Quick answer, will we have it or will we not? Mark?
Still very challenging, I must say.
Peter?
Very challenging, lots of question marks, and we hear the same also from the Council, from the Parliament. It's not a done deal yet.
No, we won't, and no, we shouldn't. We're changing the whole architecture of carbon leakage. It's extremely complex. It involves very complex trade issues, very complex climate and energy issues. When we create the ETS, we discussed it for years. You don't just switch to a CBAM in 12 months just because if some member state is pushing it ahead of elections. We need to discuss this in detail and get it right.
I think we need it quickly, because otherwise a lot of investments will be on hold until we have clarity what will be the strategy. And I think we need the strategic choices very quickly now. How the details happen then 1 more year earlier or later, I think that is not as essential then.
Well, listen, thank you everybody. Thank you, Ms. Klotz, for organizing and sponsoring the event. Thank you to our panelists, thank you to our audience, and we welcome you, invite you to our next event very soon. Thank you very much.